Alrighty, this is the teacher family for History 386. I'm Raymond Farmer, obviously, and off to the side is my grandmother, Carol Kess. She's going to be asking questions throughout. She's also taking notes, which I'm going to provide to you in the email as well. So we'll go ahead and jump right into this. Pre-revolutionary Haitian Maroon communities for History 386. So first off, we're going to start with some context. Fortunately, the Sacramento education system failed my grandmother and didn't teach her proper geography. So right now we're going to teach her where Haiti is. So Haiti is a nation that lies in the Greater Antilles, which is an island chain in the Caribbean. And so it's a part of the island of Hispaniola. So there's actually two nations. There's Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And so, yeah. So now, further context, the pre-contact and right up to contact, we have the Taínos and Columbus. So before Columbus, the indigenous peoples of Hispaniola were the Taínos. The estimated population of Taínos prior to contact varies from 300,000 to 1 million human beings. The Taínos practiced agriculture, harvesting just enough corn and sweet potatoes to subsist through the winter. So they were essentially subsistent farmers. They would harvest what they need and nothing else. And they were most likely limited to that. They couldn't really produce a surplus of agricultural goods. And so
just one second. How many people?
It's estimated to be between 300,000 or 1 million people of the indigenous Taínos. And this would have been prior to Columbus's arrival.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Okay.
So on December 6th, 1492, Columbus arrived to the island of Hispaniola, which is where the Taínos and pre-Columbian Haitians essentially resided. And so Columbus took much of the necessary Taíno harvest, dooming the indigenous peoples. And so by 1550, disease and genocide had wiped out the Taínos, leaving about a population of a few hundred. So it went from an estimated population of almost 1 million to a couple hundred in basically half a century. The Taínos, though, did not go quietly. Many of them fled to the interior mountains and other rural parts of the interior of Hispaniola. And this is not too dissimilar to the formerly enslaved Maroon communities in the following centuries. So that's why I felt the need to mention them, as the Maroons are almost a continuation of fleeing into the interior of Hispaniola to resist some form of colonial power.
Did not go quietly.
Yeah.
Okay, so did they continue to grow after that?
So probably not, seeing that there wasn't too many of them left. A lot of them, because there was also other systems at play, like a lot of them ended up being enslaved during the genocide in this thing called the encomienda system, which was basically like a proto-enslavement system of the indigenous, where they would convert them to Christianity but force them to work, kind of similar to our mission system here.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, a lot of them still did resist. Like some of them, like other forms of resistance were suicide and stuff like that, or refusing to work and stuff like that. But yeah, a lot of them winded up dying to disease or under the encomienda system.
The ones that fled?
So, well, the ones that fled, yeah, I mean, we really don't know too much about them. They would have fled into the interior. We don't know the exact amounts of them, but their population would have been pretty waned by then, so.
So they probably, not many of them survived.
Yeah, so, yeah.
Fled into mountains.
Because as we know, the population went from 1 million to a couple hundred in half a century. All right, you ready for me to go to the next slide, Grandma?
Just one second. Okay.
All right. So, let's stand over here. So, this is some more context. This is basically how French Saint-Domingue came to be, which is the colony that used to be Haiti before they declared independence, or perked up in a revolution. So essentially from 1492 up until the mid-1600s, Spain was the sole colonial power on the island of Hispaniola. But by the late 1600s, there was kind of this move to depopulate the western portion of the island. And so French pirates took over the western side, and Spain officially recognized a French colony in 1697. This would then lead to a colony known as French Saint-Domingue, which would become the richest colony in the Americas. But this wealth was built upon the backs of enslaved sugar plantation laborers that faced everyday horrors which threatened their very survival. So this is a quote from a scholar named Gonzalez, John Henry Gonzalez in particular. The sugar plantations of colonial Saint-Domingue were some of the most heavily capitalized, largest, and most profitable industrial enterprises of the early modern era. So that kind of gives you an indication of how much sugar they were cultivating there.
Wow, and the backs of the sugar plantation laborers.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, let's like the plantation labor. What actually threatened their?
So yeah, so we'll go into the conditions in the next slide.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So why did they maroon? So kind of delving further into the plantation life. So the plantation system of French Saint-Domingue was brutal and not self-sustaining in regard to its enslaved laborers. So essentially, the enslaved population was staying the same or going down. Basically, there wasn't enough people to sustain them. So yeah. So basically, it wasn't self-sustaining. So they weren't producing enough. Okay, yeah. So essentially, they weren't producing enough offspring. So more people were dying than actually procreating.
So people, okay.
Yeah. So basically, sugar cultivation and the milling of it into a shelf-stable product was painful and often deadly work. As many as 40,000 enslaved Africans a year were trafficked into Saint-Domingue to fulfill plantations' owners' desires for wealth.
Okay. So sugar cultivation. So it was really hard work.
Yeah.
That's what was painful.
Yeah. So I
interesting.
have a quote for it to kind of contextualize this. So for
Okay.
context, the former Haitian presidential spokesperson explains the toil enslaved Africans felt during sugar cultivation. So this is a direct quote.
Okay.
So the leaves of sugarcane are just like a minuscule saw.
Oh.
If they cut you, you may not even see it. But when you perspire, the sweat gets into it and burns. In the roots, there are ants. If they bite you, you will scratch yourself for half a day.
Oh, how awful.
So that's even sort of the minutiae. So this doesn't really even factor in oppression from the enslavers or the disastrous effects of getting caught in a sugar milling accident and stuff like that. But I felt like this kind of encapsulated the general day-to-day suffering of harvesting sugarcane.
400,000.
So 40,000 enslaved a year were trafficked into Saint-Domingue.
So where did they went to wherever the?
So yeah, so they would have taken there was the transatlantic slave trade, and they would have taken what was called the Middle Passage from Africa to the Caribbean, and even that was a really painful journey that not a lot of people survived.
Right. So similar to the Americans.
Yeah. So yeah, this is
Right.
basically so our enslavement system was a little bit different because our chattel enslavement systems actually were self-sustaining, unlike the sugar plantations, and I think that's more due to the fact of the brutality of harvesting sugarcane rather than the cash crops of cotton and tobacco which we had in our plantation systems.
That's true.
So
that's true. Yeah.
So
Okay.
you're fine, Grandma. So I'll go ahead and switch over to the next slide whenever you're ready. So now I'll kind of go into who exactly the Maroon people were. You're fine.
Okay.
Okay. So who were the Maroons and what did their communities mean to them? So this is another kind of excerpt from the Gonzalez scholar. So many of the former enslaved were of Congolese origin.
Okay.
So they were from the Congo area in Africa.
Oh. From Congo area of Africa?
Yeah. Which would have been Central Africa.
Okay.
So the enslaved men from the Congo, they were grizzled veterans. So they had a lot of experience fighting other groups within the Congo. Yeah. So it's really no wonder that people with combative experience would have compelled themselves to take their identity forcibly through marooning. And so these communities were safe havens from deadly plantation work and entirely antithetical to the plantation system as a whole. Scholars have given Maroon communities the moniker of a counter-plantation system.
These guys were safe havens. Okay, let's see.
So they were kind of considered counter-plantation systems rather than, Then I'll kind of delve into the differences between a plantation system and this counter-plantation system.
So these were safe havens from deadly. Okay.
Yeah, and so Maroon communities would then be a place where formerly enslaved could take back their identities with political and economic autonomy.
Did they kind of protected them?
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, they kind of formed their own communities and societies within the interior of colonial Saint-Domingue.
Oh.
So now this, I'll elaborate more on. Sorry, Grandma?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll elaborate more on what exactly the counter-plantation system was. So Maroon communities, they were scorned by the plantation system, and they chose an entirely different way of running the remote communities. The way land was distributed in Maroon communities could not be more different than that of their plantation counterparts. So rather than it being one central plantation owner that owned huge swaths of land distribution was carried out evenly in Maroon communities. And so this was so that each Maroon family could have their own plot to till crops on.
So each family could have their own plot?
Yeah, so there was essentially even land distribution.
Okay.
And then Maroon communities also differed economically through the crops they harvested. So plantations were strictly monocrop, and that meant that they only harvested sugar. That was the only thing. And so everything else, like food, tools, and clothing, they were imported. So like there was like a section in particular in one of these books that I had read where, imported Africans were essentially harvesting sugar with European-made machetes, wearing European textiles, while eating like imported European food, like fish and other preserved foodstuffs.
So they just had the sugar.
Yeah, sugar was the only thing that they were producing in Saint-Domingue.
Only crop.
But in regards to plantation communities.
Imported everything else.
So this differed significantly from Maroon communities because they harvested their own food, corn and beans. They also produced makeshift tools and procured clothing any way they could. So this then makes the formerly enslaved Maroon communities a rejection of European plantation society, while simultaneously attempting to recreate African societies within rural Hispaniola, which is the island that Saint-Domingue is on.
So they tried to recreate their where they came from.
Yeah, they tried to like recreate their own African societies because a lot of them came from like the Congo and stuff like that. So they were basically first generation enslaved people. So they were from Africa, brought over to the plantation system. Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yep. Then we'll go ahead and move into the next slide. So this is kind of interesting. Why should Americans care about Maroon communities? This is kind of significant is because there's kind of been this general consensus in American society that the Haitian Revolution was really unthinkable, that it really couldn't, like, people couldn't come up with the idea that it could actually exist. And so this is important. Maroon communities are important to Americans because it shows that even prior to the revolution, that Haitian Maroon communities show the Western world that formerly enslaved Africans in colonial Saint-Domingue had the capacity for self-governance even prior to the spark of the Haitian Revolution in 1791. So even prior to any sort of revolution underlings, there was basically formerly enslaved Africans that had entire self-governing societies within the colony of Saint-Domingue. And so, like I was saying, there's long been since this idea. So there has long since been an idea that the Haitian Revolution was unthinkable, as the thought of formerly enslaved African self-governance was impossible. So prolific Haitian writers have kind of talked about this a lot. They've kind of stressed the importance of this idea and how it has shaped the conversation, or lack thereof, of a conversation of formerly enslaved African autonomy. And so I have a quote in particular that I really liked. This is a Haitian writer named Michel Rolfe-Triot. And so this is kind of his comments about the Haitian Revolution and how people don't really talk about it. So, indeed, the contention that enslaved Africans and their descendants could not envision freedom, let alone formulate strategies for gaining and securing such freedom, was based not so much on empirical evidence as on ontology, an implicit organization of the world and its inhabitants. Although by no means monolithic, this worldview was widely shared by whites in Europe and the Americas, and by many non-white plantation owners as well. Although it left room for variations, none of these variations included the possibility of a revolutionary uprising in the slave plantations, let alone a successful one leading to the creation of an independent state.
Wow.
Yeah. So basically, society just couldn't imagine this, that Haitians could, or formerly enslaved Africans as a whole, could govern themselves. And Maroon communities are really contrary to this notion. So
did they feel that way because the people weren't probably educated?
Well, so that was the
They
issue.
were just slaves.
Well, so that's kind of the issue, is that this is even based upon Enlightenment evidence, like racism and stuff like that actually originates from the Enlightenment. And so even the higher level understanding of thinking didn't believe that formerly enslaved Africans could self-govern. We have documents from founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson who had implicit beliefs that races were different. There's this document in particular called the Notes on the State of Western Virginia, where Thomas Jefferson claims that African people are different than us because they excrete different bile in their kidneys, and therefore they're more fit to be enslaved and to do field work. So that was an Enlightenment idea. So that kind of goes into the empirical evidence as on an ontology. So even the people that were creating the implicit organization of the world and the inhabitants, there was no wiggle room there at all for enslaved African self-autonomy, or formerly enslaved African self-autonomy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, it sounds like all these other, like America, Europe, had the idea that they were less than them, that they were higher, that the Americans, the Europeans were of a higher species, almost like they were a different species.
Yeah, and that kind of ties in. There's this conception called purity of blood, and so it was kind of propagated by a lot of the the Spaniards and the Portuguese, because they had fought against Muslim invaders in Iberia, like in their homelands. Like if you've ever heard of the Reconquista, there was Muslims in Spain and they kicked them out. And so they thought because they were Christian, they were morally superior. Well, this winds up being translated into the New World with this concept of purity of blood, that I am of a Christian birth, and therefore I'm superior to others. And this, through the Enlightenment, slowly became translated into racist ideas. Like this guy, Carolus Linnaeus is his name, and he was one of the guys that really touted early racist thinkings in the Enlightenment. So
how sad.
Yeah.
Very sad.
Yes, no, it is. Yeah, and it's not talked about enough. It's a shame.
But it is very similar to the plantations, the feelings here in America.
Yeah.
The feelings that plantation owners had about their slaves, and that they thought they were above them.
Well, yeah, and so that's what makes Haiti so interesting, is because they had these Maroon communities. We didn't really have these Maroon communities in at least
in America.
Yeah, in America. So, but in colonial Saint Domingue they did. So it's just, I found that to be particularly interesting. And this is kind of the conclusions that I pulled from
Okay.
that. So overall, the Maroon communities show that pre-revolutionary, formerly enslaved Haitians did have the capacity for self-governance. This goes against the notions that they did not have the capacity for autonomy during the Revolution, and even more so prior under French rule. This then makes Maroon communities important as they discredit ideas that formerly enslaved Africans could not create successful societies. This is indeed to the contrary, as the formerly enslaved could carry out identities that were polar opposite to the brutal, profit-focused plantations.
Formerly enslaved could carry out identities. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good for them. They had to fight hard
Yeah.
to get to that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of times people will believe it when other people tell them things about them.
Mm-hmm.
If you're continually told that you're not as smart, that you're just like an animal or something,
Mm-hmm.
that you will, eventually believe that. But these guys fought against that idea.
Yeah.
It's very impressive.
And I think a lot of it has to do, at least through my own deliberation, I feel that Maroon communities really were present in colonial Saint Domingue. Meanwhile, they weren't present in our plantation systems.
Yeah.
I really do believe it is because a lot of these people were first generation Africans coming from the Middle Passage, being trafficked and making it there. And a lot of them had military experience, which gave them the means to figure out how to flee and make their own communities.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, in our system, our chattel system, basically they winded up outlawing the importation of enslaved people, and so basically the only way new slaves could be produced was through procreation. So a lot of our enslaved people would wind up being second, third generation under the plantation system, and they really had no, they didn't have any notions of what life was like back in Africa or anything like that. And I think that really prevented them from doing an autonomous action like marooning and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, because we do have instances of rebellions prior to the Civil War, like Nat Turner's rebellion in our plantation system, but we really don't have much evidence of Maroon communities like this that were in colonial Saint Domingue.
Yeah.
So ending it off, is there any questions that you have? If there's anything left that I haven't answered, we had a pretty good back and forth here, so.
Yeah, I think that you did an excellent job.
Thank you.
Excellent job, because I understand it. I can really understand.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm impressed by the Maroon communities.
Yeah.
And how they were able to do that against what everyone else was thinking.
Yep.
Going against the European, what they think, or the Europeans, the Americans,
Yeah.
to be able to rise above that.
Mm-hmm.
Very impressive.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm glad, that was my whole point, so I'm glad that I made my point across. So,
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
So we'll go ahead and end that recording here.
Okay.
Thank you so much.